Hello, this is Jeff from Mississippi in the Civil War, finally bringing you the second part of the history of the 18th Mississippi Infantry. This episode is going to cover the regiment from 1863 until 1865. If you haven't seen part one, I highly suggest you watch it first. It will cover the regiment from 1861 up through the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862, and then come back and watch this second part. And I'm sorry it's taken so long to get this done. This is just a hobby for me, so my full-time job, my wife and my daughter, they take up the majority of my time. But I knock these out as fast as I can, and sometimes they don't come as quickly as I would like. But I hope you'll enjoy this episode. The 18th was a fighting regiment. They saw a lot of action in this period we're going to be talking about in this episode, and I just hope you enjoy it. And I'll start off by just mentioning this picture I used for the title page. This is one of my favorite photographs involving Mississippians. This is members of Barksdale's brigade at Fredericksburg. This was taken by a Union photographer from their side of the river, and I just love this image. All of those guys on the other side there, I wish they were all identified, because I'm sure they had some amazing stories about the things that happened to them during the war. But still, it's a great image, and I really like it. And so we're going to pick up this episode with in the aftermath of the Battle of Fredericksburg, which took place in December 1862 and was a very significant victory for the Army of Northern Virginia. And after the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Army of Northern Virginia went into winter quarters. And they would not see any significant action until late April 1863, when the new commander of the Army of the Potomac, Major General Joseph Hooker, surprised Lee by by flanking the Confederate Army at Fredericksburg, concentrating his men at the crossroads known as Chancellorsville. Hooker had 70,000 men in Lee's rear, and he had left another 40,000 in front of Fredericksburg to try and pin the Confederate leader there. Lee only had about 60,000 men total in the Army of Northern Virginia to oppose this massive Union movement against him. Now, in the Battle of Chancellorsville, May 1st through 4th, 1863, General Lee made a very bold move. He left about 10,000 men to hold his position at Fredericksburg. He then took the remainder of his army and went out to confront Hooker. On May 2nd, Lee divided his army again and sent Stonewall Jackson with 28,000 men to make a surprise attack on Hooker's flank. Lee remained out in front of the Union host with only about 18,000 men. And while this very precarious main battle was taking place, Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade had been left behind to fight their own private little war in Fredericksburg. They had been left behind to guard the city itself. And the small band of Confederates were attacked on May 3rd, 1863 by over 25,000 Federals. And you'll see here this gray arrow is pointing toward Marie's Heights. This is the general area where Barksdale's brigade was deployed. And this is the stone wall that the 18th Mississippi was deployed behind. This area had already seen heavy action during the Battle of Fredericksburg in December. Now, a battle had not been expected at Fredericksburg, and in fact, Barksdale's brigade had received orders to rejoin the main army at Chancellorsville, and their march had only just begun when they got word that the Union forces in front of Fredericksburg were beginning to move. The men of Major General John Sedgwick's 6th Union Corps compelled them to turn back. And with so few men to try and hold the city, Barksdale had to try and hold a frontage of about 3 miles. And so we deployed his units, and behind this stone wall was the 18th Mississippi and 3 companies of the 21st Mississippi. And the Federals made an initial attack on Marie's Heights, but the Confederates fought extremely well, and they repulsed the initial assaults. But unfortunately, in the lull after the initial fighting, Colonel Griffin, who was commanding the 18th Mississippi, made a crucial mistake. And one of the men in Barksdale's brigade, William H. Moore of Company I, the 21st Mississippi, wrote a letter home a few days after the battle, and he explained what happened that was going to cause so much problems for the Confederate defenders. He wrote to his mother, "On Sunday morning about daylight, they made their first attack here on us, and we repulsed them 3 times. They then sent a flag of truce requesting permission to get off their wounded and bury their dead. Unfortunately for us, Colonel Griffin of the 18th Mississippi Regiment granted it, and under cover of this, they came up close to our works and discovered what small force we had here. And all the time the flag of truce was flying, they were arranging the plans to flank us both right and left and attack us with an overwhelming force of at least 20 to 1, coming down upon us in front so that they had us almost entirely surrounded." And this is General John Sedgwick, who was leading the Federal forces in the attack. And this is a map showing the area of the fighting at 2nd Fredericksburg. You had the 18th Mississippi here behind the stone wall. But Moore went on to say, "We were compelled to get out the best way we could. We fought as long as we could fight and as long as there was any use in fighting, and did not budge till we had positive orders to save ourselves the best way we could. About 1/2 of the brigade were taken prisoners. The rest of us managed to escape by running the risk of being killed getting away." And this is a picture taken of the 2nd Fredericksburg battlefield at the stone wall, not very long after the fighting had ended. And these dead soldiers you see in the picture were more than likely members of the 18th Mississippi that were killed in the fighting that day. And losses in the 18th Mississippi and the 3 companies of the 21st Mississippi behind the wall were heavy. The 18th had 25 men killed, 43 wounded, and a large portion of the regiment captured. The regiment also lost their flag to the 77th New York Infantry. And Brigade Commander William Barksdale recognized the bravery of the fighting that took place here, and he wrote in his official report, quote, "A more heroic struggle was never made by a mere handful of men against overwhelming odds." A member of the Washington Artillery, whose cannons had supported Barksdale's brigade in the fighting, probably summed it up even better. He wrote, quote, "I reckon now the people of the Southern Confederacy are satisfied that Barksdale's brigade and the Washington Artillery can't whip the whole Union Army." And then after defeating Hooker's main army, Lee sent reinforcements back to Fredericksburg, and the Union force withdrew from the city and returned to their starting point on the opposite side of the Rappahannock River. So after the Battle of Chancellorsville / 2nd Fredericksburg, the Army of Northern Virginia was at the height of its glory. And after this stunning victory, Lee felt it was time to take the war back to the north. And this was going to culminate in the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 1st through 3rd, 1863. In this battle, Lee commanded about 75,000 men against 88,000 Federals of the Army of the Potomac, by this time commanded by General George G. Meade. On July 1st, the rebels routed the Yankees north and west of Gettysburg and pushed them through the town to the heights beyond, as you can see here. And the 18th Mississippi, as part of Barksdale's brigade, you can see them on this map. They're on the extreme left of Barksdale's brigade. They attacked on the evening of July 2nd, 1863 at the Peach Orchard on the Emmitsburg Road south of town. In extremely heavy fighting, the Mississippians smashed the exposed Federal units in the Peach Orchard, who had been ordered to advance out in front of the main Union line by their corps commander, General Daniel Sickles. And in fighting near the Sherfy House, and this is a modern picture of the Sherfy House, at the Peach Orchard, the 18th Mississippi again suffered heavily. In a post-war account, a member of the regiment noted, quote, "At the Battle of Gettysburg, July 2nd, we had 3 color bearers. The first was Adjutant David S. Goodloe, who was wounded before he got to the house, and our recollection is he lost an arm. The second was Carol Williams, who was killed, and the third was A.J. Geis. So they lost two color bearers in the fighting, and fortunately the third made it out without being killed or wounded. Now, the power of the Mississippians' attack drove back the Federal defenders, but the losses they suffered and the new Federal reinforcements would eventually bring the Mississippians' attack to a halt. The 18th Mississippi was eventually forced to give ground, and nightfall would eventually bring an end to the fighting. Barksdale's brigade lost 791 of about 1,590 soldiers engaged, and that was about the fourth largest number of casualties for any Confederate brigade that fought at Gettysburg. The 18th Mississippi had taken 350 men into the fight at the Peach Orchard. Of that number, it had 18 killed and 82 wounded. So it was a high toll they paid for their gallant attack. One of the casualties in the 18th Mississippi was Private William Billy Blake, a member of Company K from Holmes County. Wounded in the leg on July 2nd, he had to be left behind when the Confederates retreated, when the battle ended, and he was captured by the Federals. His leg had to be amputated at the thigh, which was a extremely risky surgical procedure. The mortality rate for amputations that high on the leg was extremely high, but fortunately Blake did survive the operation. He recovered from his wound and in fact stayed in the Army, and after he was exchanged, he went on to serve in the Confederate Commissary Department in Mobile. So he was one tough kid. Now, after returning to Virginia after the loss at Gettysburg, Humphrey's brigade would not have a long time to sit around and think about the loss, because they were sent with Longstreet's corps by rail to North Georgia as reinforcements for the Confederate Army of Tennessee, commanded by General Braxton Bragg. They arrived in Chickamauga at the battlefield on the morning of September 20th. The battle had already been going on for a day. They had to make a long night march just to get there while the battle was still going on. And they went into the battle in support of Hood's division, which made a very fortunate breakthrough of the Union line. And the Union survivors, led by General George Thomas, made a last stand on Snodgrass Hill. And this is a picture of the Chickamauga National Battlefield taken near Snodgrass Hill. The Mississippians in Barksdale's brigade, or as it was now known, Humphrey's brigade, as he had taken over, helped push the Federals back to Snodgrass Hill. But on reaching the eminence, General Humphreys informed General Longstreet, quote, "I immediately moved to General Kershaw's right and met the enemy in force, driving in his skirmishers, and found him entrenched on a hill with artillery. After engaging him and reconnoitering his position, I found it impossible to drive him from it." And after giving this report, Longstreet ordered Humphreys and his Mississippians to stand fast, and he would send other divisions to try and flank the Federals out of their position on Snodgrass Hill. Despite repeated assaults, the Federals were able to hold their line, and after night fell, the Federals did successfully withdraw. Since the 18th Mississippi had not been heavily engaged in the fighting, their losses were relatively slight. They had 1 man killed and 9 wounded, which for a major battle like Chickamauga is very light casualties. And this is the position marker for Humphrey's brigade at Snodgrass Hill, just giving a little bit of explanation of the movements of the unit during the battle. So the Army of Tennessee followed up the defeated Union Army to Chattanooga and besieged them there. The 18th Mississippi was in the Confederate lines at the base of Lookout Mountain until November 4th, 1863, when Longstreet's command was detached and sent to Knoxville to deal with the Union forces there under Union General Ambrose Burnside. At Knoxville, Longstreet made what I can only term an ill-fated assault against a very well-entrenched Union force at Fort Sanders, which was a very strong earthwork fort. It had a very deep ditch around it. The ditch had frozen because of the cold weather. The Confederates got down into that ditch and couldn't get out, and it was just a shooting gallery for the Federals inside the fort. Fortunately for the 18th Mississippi, they were not assigned to the assault that day. They were on picket duty, and so they got to watch the battle while the 13th and 17th Mississippi from their brigade went into action, went into that ditch, and just got shot to pieces. So the 18th really suffered no significant casualties at all in the fighting at Fort Sanders. So after that battle, Longstreet's men spent the winter in East Tennessee before returning to Virginia for the spring 1864 campaign. So the 18th Mississippi returned to Virginia and reached Gordonsville by April 18th, 1864. They rested until May 4th, when they marched with great haste for the Wilderness to help relieve the Army of Northern Virginia that was already under attack. And they arrived on May 6th just in the nick of time to prevent Grant's Army of the Potomac from making a decisive breakthrough. Historian Dunbar Rowland wrote of the Mississippians, "Coming into the fight, the 18th Mississippi led the whole of Longstreet's corps, deploying under a murderous fire, and its promptness and firmness contributing to check the disorder in the ranks of the troops and the victorious advance of Grant's troops, which at the moment promised to sweep everything before it." And you can see here this green arrow. This is the area where Humphreys' brigade deployed and made their assault along the right of the Orange Plank Road. And the 18th Mississippi was heavily engaged, and they had the casualty list to prove it. They had 11 men killed, 74 wounded, and 18 missing in those tangled bushes and trees of the Wilderness. Then after the Battle of the Wilderness, between May 9th and June 24th of 1864, Humphreys' brigade was engaged at Spotsylvania and around the city of Petersburg, but they were not decisively engaged. It was not real heavy fighting, just sporadic, and their casualties were rather light. The 18th Mississippi had 5 killed and 24 wounded during this period. They wouldn't really see any significant fighting until August at the Battle of Berryville, Virginia. About August 12th of 1864, Humphreys' brigade was ordered to the Shenandoah Valley and took part in the Battle of Berryville, which took place on September 3rd. And in this battle, Confederate Division Commander Major General Joseph Kershaw arrived on the scene and made the decision to attack the Union forces under General Thoburn on his left flank. And a veteran of many battles, Kershaw sent his Mississippi Brigade, concealed by a patch of woods, on a short flanking march to slam into the Federal left when the time was right. He also sent his South Carolina Brigade and a Georgia Brigade forward along the axis of the Berryville Pike to smash into the Federals there. Kershaw unleashed fire from 2 artillery batteries and then ordered the Mississippians forward to exploit the Union flank. The 15th West Virginia and the 123rd Ohio fired a volley, but then quickly retreated in the face of a charge by a large number of screaming Confederates. To the left of the Mississippians, the South Carolina Brigade attacked along the pike and scattered the 2nd Maryland Eastern Shore Regiment and the 1st West Virginia, 2 of the Federal units manning the old earthworks. Help was on the way for the Federal forces, however. Duval's division came up on Thoburn's left and helped to stabilize their defensive line behind a stone wall. As Kershaw's Mississippians approached this wall, Duval's regiments unleashed a torrent of fire at them and really surprised the Confederates and brought their advance to a screeching halt. Federals under Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes then climbed over the stone wall and made a bayonet attack. And this vicious fighting pushed both the brigades of the Mississippians and the South Carolinians back approximately 1/4 mile west to the line of the old shallow earthworks that had been abandoned by the Federals earlier. North of the Berryville Pike, the attack by Kershaw's Georgia Brigade stalled when they were faced by fire from the 14th West Virginia and several of Thoburn's regrouped units. With approaching darkness, the battle became a stalemate. Steady fire was kept up after dark, with the opponents just firing at muzzle flashes. Federal Captain William McKinley wrote of this fighting, "The heavens were fairly illuminated by the flashes of our own and the enemy's guns." But then darkness, rain, and low ammunition on both sides eventually caused the fighting to wind down. In this battle, the 18th Mississippi had 6 killed, 15 wounded, and 25 missing. And among the wounded was the brigade commander himself, Brigadier General Benjamin Grubb Humphreys. The 18th Mississippi would next see action with Barksdale's brigade, or with Humphreys' brigade, at Cedar Creek, Virginia. This was another battle fought in the Shenandoah Valley, October 19th, 1864. Now, the initial attack at Cedar Creek and Kershaw's division, of which the 18th was took part in the initial assault right here, it was very successful. Humphreys' brigade managed to capture a battery of Federal artillery, but the rebels were very disorganized by their successful attack, and this gave the retreating Federals enough time to regroup and counterattack. And one Mississippi writer in a 1904 reminiscence wrote about the counterattack by the Federals and the necessity of retreating under fire. And he said, "The retreat was communicated to Humphreys' brigade in a very difficult situation. For strength of position, it had been projected somewhat beyond the general line behind a protecting stone fence. And on the first motion of withdrawal, the force we had beaten came on us and rammed Seward's left with a rush. As soon as we got on fighting ground, the men were rallied. Here the resistance was spirited, but the misfortunes of the fatal day culminated in the death of our brigade commander, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan H. Sims of the 21st Mississippi. A man of daring spirit and coolest courage, possessed of a personal dominance that swayed all around him. After his fall, the brigade was resolved into general rout." And this is the area he's talking about right here. Kershaw was in the center of the Confederate line and were forced back, and eventually the withdrawal became a rout after their brigade commander was killed. Casualties in the 18th Mississippi at Cedar Creek were 3 killed, 30 wounded, and 23 missing. And after the defeat at Cedar Creek, Humphreys' brigade was sent to Richmond, taking up winter quarters along the 9-mile road. And during the winter of 1864-65, the Army of Northern Virginia was tasked with not only protecting Petersburg, but also the city of Richmond. All the while, the Union Army of the Potomac was putting great pressure on the Confederate defensive lines at Petersburg, looking for weaknesses and trying to make a decisive breakthrough. Conditions were very difficult for the men in the trenches, and by 1865, the 18th Mississippi reported a strength of only 100 enlisted men and 5 officers present for duty. Lieutenant John W. Gower was in command of the 18th Mississippi, just slightly over 100 men. When it had first gone into the field in 1861, the 18th Mississippi had numbered over 1,100. So on April 2nd, 1865, the Confederate lines at Petersburg were fatally ruptured. General Lee ordered a retreat from Petersburg and then informed President Davis that Richmond would have to be evacuated. A member of Humphreys' brigade later wrote about this retreat, and he said, "Kershaw's men prepared 3 days' rations, light ones, April 2nd. They evacuated the lines below Richmond at midnight, passing through Richmond early the next morning, April 3rd. Humphreys' Mississippi Brigade formed the rear and was the last of the Army of Northern Virginia infantry to tread the streets of the Confederate capital. The last scrap of rations was devoured before nightfall on the 5th. The march was kept up all that night. The trials and toils of the 6th, which were as severe as any troops ever underwent, were borne without the sustenance of a morsel of food. And on April 6th, the corps of Generals John B. Gordon and Richard Ewell were attacked by the Federals as they were passing through the bottomlands of Sailor's Creek, which was a tributary of the Appomattox River. The 18th Mississippi was part of Ewell's command, and they were among the troops placed on his right on the west side of Little Sailor's Creek, and they were attacked by an overwhelming Union force. One Confederate, Major Robert Stiles, later wrote, "We were attacked simultaneously front and rear by overwhelming numbers, and quicker than I can tell it, the battle degenerated into a butchery and a confused melee of brutal personal conflicts. I saw a number of men kill each other with bayonets and the butts of muskets, and even bit each other's throats and ears and noses, rolling on the ground like wild beasts." In this fighting at Sailor's Creek, entire Confederate brigades were overwhelmed and forced to surrender or face annihilation. General Ewell and 7 other Confederate generals were captured, along with about 6,000 of their men. And included among these 6,000 were a number of the 18th Mississippi. But some of them did escape and managed to rejoin the remainder of the Confederate Army for the retreat to the west. And this retreat ended on April 9th, 1865, when the Army of Northern Virginia was cornered at Appomattox Courthouse. And unable to break out, General Robert E. Lee elected to surrender his army to General Ulysses S. Grant at the McLean home at Appomattox. Humphrey's Mississippi Brigade memorist J.S. McNeely, who was a member of the 21st Mississippi, indicated that he was among the first to be imprisoned, and he commented on the surrender of Humphrey's brigade and the 2 other Mississippi brigades in the Army of Northern Virginia. And he said, in the final roundup at Appomattox, Mississippians were woefully scarce, even where the army was a skeleton. And he was right about this. The previous day's battles, particularly at Sailor's Creek, had lost Humphrey's brigade a lot of its men. So there was only a token force remaining to surrender at Appomattox. In fact, the 18th Mississippi surrendered at Appomattox 4 officers and 44 privates. That were all that had managed to remain with the Army after the mass capture at Sailor's Creek. So they were a very small number that were there to witness the final end of the Army in Northern Virginia. But the 18th Mississippi was a well-regarded regiment. It fought extremely well in every battle it was ever in, and they brought great credit to themselves and their state. And the men were then faced with having to go home, making a 1,000-mile journey back to Mississippi, and then having to try and rebuild their lives and their state, which had been just devastated by the hand of war. And I just hope you enjoyed this episode. Hope to bring you more on other regiments that fought from Mississippi. If you've got any thoughts about unit histories you'd like to see on this program, let me know. If I get a lot of requests for it, I'll definitely try and do it. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them. If you haven't subscribed, please do so, because it really helps me gauge how much interest there is in providing more of this content. But I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed doing it, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.